Hi everyone, welcome to this recorded lecture. Now, what I've got in this particular recorded lecture is I'll basically cover enough material in this to cover the classes on Monday, that's today. Monday was it the 3rd of November, I'm losing track of time, sorry, and tomorrow's lecture, or tomorrow's class, Tuesday. So this is the first lecture in the new section of the module. We're finished geography and elections, so we're moving on to politics and the environment, or policy making and the environment. The first set of lectures, I'm going to talk about the environmental movement, environmental activism. The next set will be about devising environmental policy and the issues faced, or the challenges faced, or the difficulties faced when trying to make environmental policies. And the last group of lectures in this series will be looking at a case study, namely Ireland's attempts to develop an effective policy in relation to the area of climate change, it's a really difficult area to devise effective policy in, as I'll discuss hopefully in 2 weeks' time. Now, there's a set of readings there. You can dip into these as you're going along. By and large, any general textbook on environmental politics, it's a section or a sub-topic or sub-discipline within political geography and within human geography of its own right. So there is a good number of books you can dip into in the library. Right, before I get to the nitty-gritty of these two classes, the first question to ask today is, what is politics? And I start by saying that there's different understandings of what politics is, and the way you define or understand politics ultimately will dictate the way you look at a number of different aspects or elements of topics such as environmental politics. Generally, most people will agree that there is one particular element that's common to all understandings of politics, and that is that it involves in some form a study of political power. So power is seen to be a key issue or key concept within politics. Now, there are different ways of understanding power. It's suggested, and I'll go through these in the next few slides, that there's 3 different models of power. Pluralism, which is the most optimistic of them. Elitism, which is a less optimistic model or understanding of power. And structuralism, which is quite similar in tone to Marxism or left-wing philosophy. As I said, pluralism is the most optimistic understanding of power. It says that power is widely but not evenly spread through society. So it says, look, everyone has potential to get access to political power, but it does recognize that there's a level of unevenness there. There are some inequalities in terms of the degree of access that certain people or influence, the degree of access or influence that certain people will have in relation to power and in relation to the people who make power, the policymakers. Pluralism is interested in what is the observable exercise of power by different elite groups, whether they're political, economic, or social elites. A key element within the model of pluralism is to understand or study the importance of pressure groups, but recognizing that all pressure groups are there to just represent a particular strand in society. Pressure groups don't represent the views or interests of every person in society. So that's the pluralist model of power. The next model of power is elitism. And for me, a lot of what I'm going to say in the next, in these 6 sessions or 6 classes on environmental policy making, I think a lot of the really interesting ideas out of these 3 models comes from this particular model, elitism. And there's some really important concepts that I'll come back to again and again in the next 4 or 5 classes. So elitism suggests that there is privileged access to power makers. There's privileged access to key policy makers, key decision makers, that is awarded only to certain groups in society, what's called insider groups. And other groups are excluded from access to power makers or decision makers. So the idea that you have insider groups and outsider groups, elite groups for want of a better word. The insider groups have access to decision makers, and depending on just how influential or powerful they are, these insider groups can actually help to influence decision makers as well. Outsider groups, by contrast, for various reasons, they tend to be excluded from the decision-making process. They tend to have little or no influence over policymakers or decision makers. Now, most insider groups will be powerful because they have economic clout, either political clout or economic clout. So we'll talk about the key insider groups, mainly in relation to Ireland, in the next few lectures. But generally, you can think of business groups as being a very significant insider group. In Ireland, we talk about farmers. The farmers' lobby has been a fairly significant insider group because of the political clout and that group has. So usually, insider groups have economic clout and maybe also a certain level of political clout. The farmers' lobby has a lot of clout because when it comes to elections, and if you remember the set of lectures, online lectures I did last week, farmers are a group of people that tend to turn out in very big numbers, particularly at local elections and general elections. Maybe not so much at the presidential election, which took place a few days ago, but when elections really seem to matter, you will see a big turnout of the farmers' lobby and the farmers' group at election time. And that gives them a fairly significant level of political clout. As a group, probably a lot more influential maybe 10, 20 years ago. Definitely Irish politics has become more urbanized, urban focused, especially relative to the 1990s, for instance, even the 1990s. So, but the farmers' lobby has a certain degree of power. In terms of demography, older age groups tend to have more clout than younger age groups. And again, it goes back to this thing of turning out to vote in elections. If you're a politician, who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to a students group and say, well, in that students group, maybe 2 out of 10 in that group's going to vote in an election, and probably chances are they're not going to vote for me anyway? Or will you listen to and pay attention to the older age groups, and you say, well, maybe 70 or 80% of this group's going to turn out to vote in an election. I think I have a good chance of, maybe if I do a good job for this group, persuading maybe half of them even to vote for me at the next election or vote for my party. So insider groups tend to have a lot of economic clout, sometimes a lot of political clout, and they are the groups that are listened to by decision makers. Sometimes can even influence decision makers. Now, I'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about environmental groups in the next few minutes, but when we're talking about influencing, it's not, a lot of times the influencing is done behind the scenes. It's a very quiet form of influencing. Why is sometimes called lobbying, where you never see business groups going out and protests. If they have an issue that they want to raise with key decision makers, whether it's the politicians, whether it's the civil servants, a lot of that work is done behind the scenes. A lot of that work is, and it's not been that it's done kind of, I'm not saying that it's top secret and that, but a lot of these meetings will take place, a lot of this will be based around meetings that will usually take place between the decision makers and the lobby groups, people lobbying for the interests of these insider groups. Insider groups also tend to be pretty organized, well organized. So if they want to get a message across to politicians or other key decision makers, they know how to do it. They know how to organize. They know how to communicate their ideas. Outsider groups, by contrast, as I said, they don't have this privileged access to decision makers. They usually have very little or no access. Outsider groups can be groups that are excluded groups. So you can talk about the unemployed, you can talk about migrant groups. I would even say student groups are probably an outsider groups. We're going to talk today about environmental groups. And by and large, environmental groups would probably fall into this outsider group categories. There are outsider group category. There are periods, such as when the Green Party are in government, periods when the Green Party in government, where environmental groups might have a bit more influence to decision makers, but by and large, they tend to be a group that are often classified within this group of outsider groups. So that's one key concept, the concept of insider and outsider groups that we associate with this elitism model. And this is why you might notice I'm giving this model a lot more attention than the other two models, because I think there's some really interesting ideas that you can draw from this model. The other key concept that comes from elitism is the concept of non-decision making. And this relates to how lobby groups, insider groups, can lobby to ensure that decisions are not taken by policymakers that would work against their interests, even if those decisions, that could be unpopular with the public. So this shows how a good, well-organized insider group can lobby to try and avoid. It's not a case that you want politicians to come out and say, oh, we have this issue and we're not going to do anything about it. Politicians don't want to do that because if it's an unpopular thing to do, they don't want to be seen doing it. And to be honest, insider groups don't want the politicians to do that. So generally, insider groups will lobby politicians to, instead of making hard and fast decisions in the here and now, they'll generally try to lobby politicians to put things on the long finger, to not take a decision, to try and remove things from the political agenda. And there's various mechanisms or tactics that you can use here. Most of these involve various strategies where you try to buy time, buy for time. So you can do things like say, look, yeah, this is a big issue. We're really concerned about this. We're listening to the public, but we need more information. We need more research on this topic. So we're going to do that research. And when we get those findings, we'll come back and we'll do something. The reality is this is buying for time, as I said. And sometimes when we get to the issue attention cycle next week, this will make hopefully a bit more sense. This can often happen where there's a big push to do something on a topic like the environment. So maybe air pollution or climate change. And politicians who kind of are listening to the public on the one hand, or listening to environmental groups on the one hand, but also listening to the business and farmers lobby on the other hand. Generally, this is a kind of a nice, well, not that nice for the public, but for politicians, this can be a nice get-out clause, this kind of non-decision-making approach where you're buying for time to say, look, we care about the climate, but we need more information. Or we care about the environment, we care about the climate, but we need to put the right apparatus or organization in place. So we might want more research on this topic. Or we might need to set in place an advisory body to help us. And that's going to take time. So you're buying for time. In other cases, you might say, look, in other cases, it might say, we need a tribunal of inquiry here. So all these are mechanisms that involve buying for time. It can involve a lot of, over the next few years, you're sitting back waiting for something to happen. A lot of information is being gathered. And at the end of all this, what you might get is a 5,000-page report that no one really wants to read, even the boffins, even the academics. And usually that report will come out at a point in time, 2 or 3 years later, where the big hullabaloo about that topic has died down. People have got interested in other things. And when the report comes out, it's sort of like, oh, right. And ultimately, by this process of non-decision making, the politicians have effectively avoided having to take an unpopular decision, and they've more or less moved this issue off the political agenda to another time where, to be honest, people aren't really that pushed anymore. Okay, the next model then is structuralism. And this is very much associated with the Marxist view of the world. So structuralism is basically saying that everything that's done in politics reflects the role of capitalism, everything reflects the basic economic structure of society, and ultimately decision makers will only act in the interests of those who own capital, business interests. And ultimately the argument there is environmental problems that exist are ultimately a knock-on effect of the capitalist system. Now, if you say to a structuralist, someone operating from this model power, say, hang on a second, actually the government came up with this really good environmental policy here. I think this is working. So say back in my days, it was the plastic bag levy or some other policy like that. You say, hang on a second, no, the government's doing this, or the government increased social welfare by X amount in the last budget. The general argument of structuralists would say, look, this is just a SOP. It's just, you're just trying to avoid class conflict by just doing these little things for the environment or for the general public. So that's the structuralism model. As I said, we looked at 3 different models of power. Of the 3, for this particular set of lectures, for environmental policy making as a general area of study, I really think probably the elitism model is the most interesting one. It's a more cynical or jaundiced view of political power than what you get with the pluralism model. Obviously it does draw in the influence of business interests, because when you're talking about insider groups, a lot of times you have to count in key business interests, but it doesn't see the capitalist system as a be-all and all of everything, as would be the case with structuralism. So I think of the 3 models, the one I'll come back to again and again is the elitism model. And I'll definitely talk about some of the concepts associated with that model, such as insider groups and outsider groups, and the concept of non-decision making. Okay, so policies come from political processes. There are important people in policy making. Obviously, the most important people in policy making, you would imagine, are people who are in government, government actors, politicians. But there's other key players involved as well. Ultimately, the policies that actually get drawn up are not actually drawn up by the politicians themselves. Obviously, to varying degrees, they will have some say on this. But a lot of the policies are drawn up by the civil service, the administration. So senior civil servants, in some ways, are as important. It could be even argued they might be even more important than the politicians, because governments come and go, governments change, but the civil service stays the same. And the civil service, you're all too young to remember the Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister comedy series from, when was it? Probably, oh God, the 1980s now, it's decades ago. But that shows how the civil service can more or less operate behind the scenes, influence politicians to try and more or less maintain what they want to see, namely the status quo. Policies are complex matters. There's different actors involved. There's politicians, but within the politicians group, some politicians have a lot of clout. The government, the Prime Minister, or Taoiseach in Ireland, the ministers. Other politicians aren't as influential. So even within the government parties, backbenchers really don't have that much power. If you're not in government, unless you can do something through committees, or unless you come up with a good idea in a parliamentary exchange that the government says, actually, that's a good idea, we'll go with that, thanks, we're going to steal your idea. If you're in the opposition parties, really you have very little influence over power. So a lot of the politicians really don't have that much influence over power. It's restricted mainly to maybe about a handful of politicians. Other actors are important as well. Remember our insider groups, they're going to have some degree of influence over policy making, and they'll use various mechanisms, mainly lobbying mechanisms, to try and get their ideas across. So there's different actors involved. Some have power, some have less power, some have no power. Some have a lot of skin in the game in relation to policy, and they will do their utmost to try and get the results they want to see. Others may have a lot of interest in one policy, not so much interest in other policies. There's always potential for conflict in relation to policy between competing interests, between groups who want different things in relation to a policy. Some groups who may favour the introduction of policy, other groups may not. Different alliances between different actors will emerge in relation to different issues. So this is an interesting point, and this is what I want to get across, that sometimes the easy kind of uncritical approach to take to environmental policy making is always, business groups are against the environment, they don't want things, they're against the environment, they don't want environmental legislation, environmental regulation. But sometimes you might find that business groups actually want this because it's good for their business, if nothing else. If you're an industry, if you're someone like Intel, you want a clean environment because your manufacturing process depends on that. So in some cases, you might actually find that business groups may be fairly anti-environmental in relation to some policy issues. In relation to other policy issues, they could be quite proactive in terms of actually supporting action on the environment. And you get various interesting coalitions emerging. In some cases, you may have a coalition between business groups and environmental lobby groups that you wouldn't have in relation to another issue, because maybe all the business groups are totally against that particular idea. In Ireland, power is really, as it says there, it's exercised by a range of public institutions, so the government, the civil service, at the local authority level, the county councillors, but also the city manager or county manager, and the administrators within the county council and the city councils. Private institutions can have a degree of influence over decision making as well. Business groups, farmers' lobbies, etc., etc. Ireland is a small country, so ultimately another key factor associated with policy making in Ireland is generally the fact that the people who hold power in Ireland at different levels generally tend to know each other quite well. In some cases, they might have gone to the same school. So Ireland is a relatively small country, so you might find that key leaders in the business sector may actually know some politicians quite well. They may have been old rugby friends, for instance, or they may have played on the same GA team. And they may also know some of the senior servants quite well. Generally, in Ireland as well, you generally tend to find there is a degree of commonality in any case between the business lobby and the political class or the political elite. By and large, their general worldview isn't that far removed. The general worldview of the political class and the business class generally sees development as a good thing, economic growth as a good thing, and generally they will try and pursue policies that promote economic growth. Because from the point of view of the politicians, a healthy economy means a more positive view of the government, a greater level of support for the government, and ultimately a strong economy means you've got a better chance of staying in power at the next general election. So if you say take the 2024 general election, there was 3 parties in government going into the election, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party. The Green Party had a bad election, but this is what's in. I'll come to this maybe in 2 weeks' time. Ireland's a strange country in that we have a lot of coalition governments, and usually the party that suffers the most in the coalition government election at subsequent or following general election is usually the smallest party. So I think this was partly a small party effect, but because the economy is doing quite well over the last few years, ultimately the 2 largest parties in that government were returned to power, and actually both parties gained seats at the 2024 general election. So yeah, a strong economy generally means an outgoing government has a better chance of returning to power. So it's in the it's in the self-interest of politicians to promote economic growth. But obviously, let's be honest, it's in the interest of everyone across the state to have economic growth, I would argue. Anyway, how do governments organise? Governments tend to be organised on what I say there, government departments. Governments and government departments are organised on functional lines. So in Ireland, you'll have, when you have a new government set up, you'll have a Prime Minister or Taoiseach, a Deputy Prime Minister or Taoiseach, and then you'll have, I think, roughly, it's 15 different senior ministers. The Deputy Prime Minister or Taoiseach holds one of these ministerial positions as well. So governments are broken up into a number of different departments. And each department controls a certain area. Some departments are more powerful or influential than other departments are. So the most important or most influential department of all is the Department of Finance, because the Minister of Finance ultimately holds the purse strings. And in some ways, they're nearly as influential, I suspect, as the Deputy Prime Minister would be. So the Finance is a very influential department. Enterprise, very influential. Business, enterprise business, very influential. In Ireland, the Department of Agriculture is quite an influential department for historical reasons. Other departments mightn't be as significant or as influential. So maybe the Department of Sport, for instance. The Department of Environment probably edges a little bit more towards the bottom of that influential. Now, it was slightly different in the government we had between 2020 to 2024 because the Greens were in government, and one of the three-party leaders that kind of dominated that government, Eamon Ryan, was also, as well as being the leader of the Green Party, he was also the Minister for Environment. So there was a certain degree of clout, more clout given to that department in the previous 4 years, for instance. Now, this is something I'll come back to again, administrative fragmentation. One of the problems of having governments being broken up into different departments is you tend to find that there isn't a lot of coordination between different departments. And sometimes departments can be pursuing policies that go against the interests of other departments. This isn't, ultimately, departments almost act as if they're separate kingdoms in themselves. That, look, we have our own job to do. We're going to hunker down now, focus on enterprise, and that's that. And this can be an issue, particularly for something like environmental policy, where you actually need, for different environmental issues, you need to get buy-in from different government departments. But sometimes government departments will say, look, the Minister of Environment wants us to do this, but look, how dare he or she suggest that, because this is our department, we'll make the decisions for our department, and we're not going to be dictated by the Department of Agriculture. So administrative fragmentation, where you get this breaking up of government into different departments, it causes issues because departments almost start to act as if they're separate kingdoms, and also it causes problems that because different departments have more influence than other departments have when it comes to decision making. Another key point to note is we'll talk a lot about devising policies in these set of lectures, but there is a gap between what is drawn up in the policy and what actually happens in real life. So this is what's called the implementation deficit gap. The idea that there is a gap between what a policy seeks to achieve and what actually happens as a result of that policy. And this can be a big issue, for instance, with the environment, because as I'll say later on, hopefully I'll remember to say this later on, ultimately, in official terms, the bodies responsible for developing policies on the environment in Ireland are focused on the government. So the government, or more specifically the Department of Environment or the Minister for Environment. Now, admittedly, as I'll suggest later on, a lot of policies are sometimes developed at the European Union level, and all the Minister for Environment is doing is transposing these or putting these into Irish law. But when it comes to implementing these policies, in a lot of cases, the bodies who are responsible for implementing environmental policies are actually the local authorities or the county councils and city councils. And sometimes they just don't have the manpower or the influence or the time or maybe even the motivation to effectively implement and manage these policies. Last point on this slide, it's one I made already, the idea that by and large, the different elite groups or powerful groups in society, in Irish society, tend to have a very similar stance on the economy, generally where they see development is good and economic growth is good. But I said that already in the previous slide. So who are the key people in relation to power policy making and power in Irish society? As I said, politicians have a degree of clout, particularly, but mainly politicians who are members of the government. Not just members of the government in terms of I'm a member of Fianna Fáil or I'm a member of Fine Gael or I'm one of the independents supporting the government, but more specifically, those who are senior ministers. So the Taoiseach has a lot of clout, Taoiseach has a lot of clout, ministers have a lot of clout, some, but not all ministers have equal clout. Minister for Finance has a lot of clout. Minister for Sport, maybe not as much clout outside their own area. But it's not just the politicians who have power who have a role to play when it comes to policy making in Ireland. Perhaps as important or more important are the senior civil servants, as I've discussed already. These are the permanent government. Elections happen, governments lose power, and politicians may effectively be only in power for a small number of years, but the senior civil servants will be there until they retire. And senior civil servants have a certain worldview. They tend to be quite probably more conservative than the politicians are, more resistant to change, an outlook on the economy that generally sees economic growth as a good thing, as would be the case with politicians and the business elite, and a high level of self-conscious nationalism. Insider groups in Ireland generally are the representatives of the key economic interest groups. The most important lobbies I would suggest in Ireland, perhaps the most important lobby of all, is IBEC, which represents business interests. So the IBEC is the Irish Business and Employers Confederation. When they cough, governments listen. And for the farmers lobby, one of the most significant farmers lobby groups is the IFA, the Irish Farmers Association. Now, these lobby groups have insider status. They have a lot of clout. They will, if they want to get a message to government, they'll have no issues getting that message to government. And there are various mechanisms they can use to do so. So they can use lobbying, they'll write letters in the newspaper, they'll write opinion pieces, they might even use advertising to get across their ideas. They generally tend to be very well organized groups. They know what they want to say, they know how they want to say it, and they know who they want to say that to. And they are able to contact, more importantly, the people that they want to say this to. The outside groups, by contrast, have very little power or influence. Generally, if they're trying to get messages across, they tend to go for down the route of protests or direct action, which ultimately doesn't have the same clout or effectiveness as the lobbying approaches used by the insider groups. Environmental groups would fall into that category. So this brings us on then to environmental groups. Now we'll start with the first environmental groups. The first environmental groups date back to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. As groups, they tend to be made up of the upper classes in society and generally tended to focus environmental groups in the 1800s were generally single issue groups, usually focusing on things like wildlife protection, so the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals or Protection of Birds. These groups, which are still very much with us today, these groups, their origins date back to this period, also focusing on protecting the countryside as an amenity, so preserving the countryside as the amenity to which people could go for a few weeks to get away from the smog and the smoke of the cities and more or less clean out their lungs for a few weeks. Generally, these groups actually tend to be quite effective groups because they were members of the upper classes. They were the same members of the same class group as the politicians were. So they generally tended to focus on petitioning or lobbying Parliament to change legislation and bring in certain anti-cruelty measures. One of which I seem to remember that was a big thing was banning the use of feathers in ladies' hats, for instance. That was one of the things that were brought in. So various anti-cruelty measures. So they were quite effective groups, but very small groups. And as I said already, groups tended to focus on, individual groups tended to have their own issue that they would focus on. Now, the next phase in the development of environment groups probably dates to the 1960s. And we're looking now at modern environmental groups. Generally, there's a number of big differences between the groups of the 1800s and the groups of the 1960s, 1970s, and the modern era. Modern environmental groups tend, especially the larger ones, modern environmental groups tend to focus on a number of different environmental issues. So this is partly a recognition that there is a degree of linkage or interrelationship between different environmental issues and environmental problems. So you don't tend to get as many single issue groups as you would have in the 1800s. Another key element here is that a lot of the very large groups tend to be international in scope. So Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace. And this also reflects another dimension of environmental issues and problems, that a number of problems and issues are transboundary in nature, they cross political boundaries. So how do you resolve issues to do with river pollution? If you're looking at a large river, like say the River Rhine in Europe, can the Netherlands resolve river pollution on their own? They can't really do anything if the pollution is already being caused further upstream, say in Germany or France or in Switzerland. So, and climate change is obviously it's a really obvious transboundary environmental problem. Growth patterns in growth patterns in environmental groups, in membership of environmental groups, tends to be cyclical. So the number of members in groups tends to go up and down quite a bit. It generally tends, to be honest, to reflect the fact that interest in the environment or interest in big environmental issues such as climate change, that tends to be quite cyclical as well. I'll come back to this, as I mentioned this earlier on. I'll come back to this when I'm talking about issue attention cycles. Yeah? But this reflects the idea that there are periods where there's a lot of interest in the environment, a lot of interest in topics such as climate change. You get a certain period where there's a big jump in interest levels. I think in Ireland, in the Western world, the most recent example of that was 2019, where you had this sudden upsurge of climate strikes or climate protests, particularly climate strikes organised by schools. And all of a sudden, the climate was pushed back towards the top of the political agenda. And in Ireland, that had a knock-on effect politically because the Green Party had a number of good elections then over the next 12 months, the local and European elections in June 2019, and then they had a very good result at the general election in February 2020. But then, after a period of time, interest levels drop. And you see this reflected also, as the point in the slide suggests there, it's also reflecting the fact that as interest levels in environmental issues increases or declines, this also has a knock-on effect on membership levels of these groups. Now, there are differences between environmental groups. There's obviously, I'd skip to the second one. There's obviously a difference in terms of size. Some environmental groups are large, very large groups, very much globally based in scope. Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace. Other groups may organise on a more regional basis or a more national basis, and some groups may be focused on local issues and are operating on a solely local basis. Environmental groups have a wide range of issue concerns. Some are concerned with recreation, others with conservation, amenity, and resources. There's also differences in terms of how groups organise themselves, and there's also differences in terms of the political approaches taken by groups. How do groups try to achieve their aims and objectives? What mechanisms do they use? So if we talked about, say, the 1800s environmental group, we saw environmental groups, they would have been very much based on that. They'd have been very well organized. You would have had a president, a secretary. They would have been very well organized groups. There would have been a hierarchy within the groups, and they would have generally focused on petitioning and lobbying parliamentary members. And generally, they were quite effective in what they set out to do. When you move to the new environmental groups in the 1960s and 1970s, they were very different, organized very differently, and there's a very different political approach to the 1800 groups in the 1800s. So they tended to be radical in terms of their political approaches. They generally tended to focus on direct action and protest. They didn't want to engage in lobbying because they felt that was putting them part of a flawed political system. In terms of organization, these groups tended to be grassroots-based, use grassroots-based organizational approaches, which basically means that they tried to avoid having recognizable leadership. They tried to avoid having a hierarchy within the group. So you get various things like, okay, well, if we have to have a leader, we're going to rotate that position. No one's going to be allowed to be leader for more than a year or more than 2 years, and we'll rotate positions. So grassroots style groups. When you move into the 1980s, you start to see some of these environmental groups becoming more pragmatic and reverting back to more conventional forms of organization, where you do have a recognizable leadership structure, and moving back to more conventional political tactics or maneuvers, where some of the groups, especially the more better resource groups, are using lobbying instead of protests to try and achieve their ends. So the slide there shows different ways you can classify groups. I won't be too worried about the names of the groups there. I'll talk about the differences. So on the one hand, you've got political efficacy. So that's the row at the top there. So political efficacy, oh God, I can't even say it. Efficacy, political efficacy, that basically means the political approaches that groups are using. So conventional methods would be involving lobbying, mainly petitioning politicians. The opposite of that is disruption, and this reflects an approach to politics where you're using direct action and protest as opposed to lobbying. On the other side, then, you have two different ways of organizing groups: professional, where you've got a recognized leadership within the group, and where you might actually be hiring or paying people to run different aspects of the group's activities. Participatory or grassroots groups tend to try to avoid having a leadership structure, or if there's a leadership structure, they'll try to rotate positions. So they don't want to give a lot of power to a small number of people within the groups. And generally, all the work within these groups will be done on a voluntary basis. So they won't be paying experts to come in and run aspects of the group's activities. So as I said 2 slides back, in the 1960s and 1970s, the new groups that emerged then were very much based on grassroots style organization and very much focused on direct action and protests as a means of trying to achieve their political ends or their political aims. In the 1980s, you start to see a bit of a movement within the environmental movement and within environmental groups. Now, when we talk about environmental movement, I just notice this here. We're talking about environmental groups. We're also talking about green parties as well as part of this environmental movement. And a lot of what I'm talking about here in relation to environmental groups was also happening with green parties at that same period of time. So they started to become more institutionalized, more conventional in how they did business and how they organized themselves. So you start to see, first of all, a more recognized leadership structure in groups, but they're also starting to employ professionals to run aspects of the group's activities. So maybe some were hired as professional organizers, others were hired as professional lobbyists. So why was this? In one way, it was kind of reflecting the success of environmental groups. They'd achieved certain aims. The very popular environmental groups had achieved a certain level of membership, and membership fees ensured that groups had a fair amount. Groups now had a fairly large amount of money that they could use. And from the 80s onwards, they started using that money a bit more to hire people to do things for the group. So whether it was hiring people to run the group or run aspects of the group's activities, or in some cases they were hiring experts or lobbyists to get across the group's message or to try and influence policymakers. As the last point of the slide says, that as campaigns become more and more evolved, groups, especially the large groups, start to realize they needed a lot more expertise in areas such as science, politics, or the media, or indeed management. So groups start to realize, if we want to actually achieve something, we actually need people who know what they're talking about. So if you want to lobby politicians, we need to talk to people who have expertise in this area. If we want to educate the public on environmental issues, we need to actually make sure we've got the science. We fully understand the science ourselves. If you want to try to influence politicians, but also the public, we may need to engage in a form of advertising. So we need some media expertise and so on. There was three different aspects of institutionalization. Organization grew up more or less provided the resources to allow for this. Internal institutionalization reflects to how groups organize themselves. External institutionalization reflects to the political approach taken by these groups. And we've talked about that in the previous slide, so I won't go and bore you anymore about this. Now, there were advantages of institutionalization. In some ways, groups were probably a lot more effective in terms of what they were trying to do, because a lot of times the most effective way of trying to influence policymakers and politicians is usually lobbying. The more you can, if you can lobby politicians directly, they're going to be more receptive to what you're trying to say, because you're sitting down in a meeting, they're willing to listen. They're going to be more receptive to what you're trying to say than they would be if you're having a protest outside their offices. And they're going, OMG, these lot are back again protesting. Oh, I'll have to stay in here down till 11 tonight because I won't be able to get out of this building. I can't stand that group. Whereas if you're lobbying them directly and you're actually, if you're good and you're making good arguments, the politician might say, you know what, okay, we can actually do something here. That's a good point. So I think ultimately, in terms of trying to get things done in the environment, probably this move towards greater institutionalization in the 1980s and 1990s probably did help the environmental lobby quite a bit. And also the fact that groups were becoming better organized. The problem is, as you move from grassroots style approaches to more professional approaches, you do tend, the organization of the group tends to be less hands-on, whereas you would be calling on ordinary group members to do things in the past. You don't need them anymore. You're sort of like, and it can sort of become a case that really all the ordinary members, the only thing the ordinary members are doing for you is providing you a membership fee that allows you to get things done and pay people to get those things done. So there is the risk that you lose touch with your regular members, including radical members, well, but not just radical members. You lose touch with all your ordinary members. The members are sort of going like, what am I getting out of this anymore? 5 years ago, well, I was a member of this group 5 years ago, and I was being asked to do things. I was getting involved in activities. Now they don't seem to want me to do that anymore. Now they just want my membership fee. And there's also an issue as well. It also creates divisions within groups as well, because there's different members of environmental groups. You see the same with Green Party. So sometimes people talk about a fundie versus a real law conflict within environmental groups and Green Parties. The fundies, or the radicals, generally want things to stay as they were in the 60s and 70s. They want groups and parties to remain organised on a grassroots style basis. They want to go down the route of protest. They don't want to get involved directly in the political system, because they don't see that as something they should be getting involved with. The real O's, or the pragmatists, on the other hand, tend to be those who see a value in more professionalization, a more considered, a more nuanced or more conventional political approach. And these fundy real law conflicts, or conflicts between radical members and pragmatic members, have become part and parcel of environmental groups and indeed Green Parties over the last few decades or so. Almost as a reaction to, in some ways, to a growing professionalization, institutionalization of the environmental movement, you got a third wave of environmentalism in the 1990s, and a new resurgence of grassroots bodies focusing on areas such as radical social movements, small local groups protesting against Lulu. That's not a famous Scottish singer who first appeared in the 1960s. That's Lulu, locally unwanted land uses. And the environmental justice movement as well, that emerged in the 90s and 2000s, was again very much based around grassroots style approaches. Environmental groups as new social movements. There's a very long quote here from Neil Leonard's book. The one thing I want to draw from this is the idea that what he says about the membership of new social movements. Who are the members of new social movements? So the environmental groups that emerged in the 60s and 70s, these would also be included as new social movements. And this is interesting what Leonard says here. Leonard says here that a lot of these new social movements, the membership of them tended to be made up of what he calls the new middle class. So who are the new middle class? The new middle class, to understand the new middle class, you need to understand what was happening in Western society after World War II. You were seeing the creation of welfare state systems, but also you're seeing more and more government investment in a lot of Western countries, with the exception of Ireland, I should add, in secondary school education, but also university education. So a lot more people were moving on to university education in countries like Britain, USA, France, and Germany. And there was openings being created to allow the children of working class families to also make their way into university education. Now, what happened to these? So they were working class, children of working class family, but they went on to get a university education. So basically they had the skills and the qualifications to allow them to take up classic middle class white collar jobs. So they were kind of almost like they formed a new class group. So in terms of politics, this new middle class group was probably no longer as interested in the old working class left-wing socialist style politics that their parents would have been interested in. But on the other hand, they weren't interested in the old conservative Christian Democrat style of politics that the old middle class would have been interested in. So they started to become a fairly large group of people who were looking for a different style of politics. So they started to try to increase their levels of political involvement, And at the same time, they were focused, as Leonard suggested, on defending their local communities' autonomy from state infrastructural projects in their area. So the new middle class, basically children of working class families who became middle class ultimately because they achieved university level education, but in political terms they couldn't find a common home with the old working class politics of Labour or socialist parties, or the old style middle class politics of conservative or Christian Democrat parties. So there were a group of people who were looking for new groups or new political parties to align themselves with. And this new middle class group makes up a lot of the members of the environmental groups that emerged in the 60s and 70s. And the same applies to the new Green parties that emerged in the 70s and 80s. One of the things that often gets lobbied or leveled against environmental groups, particularly smaller scale environmental groups, is that people accuse them of what's called NIMBYism. So NIMBYism, NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And generally, groups like these are often accused of being narrow-minded and self-interested. So what's a NIMBY group? A NIMBY group is usually a group that's protesting against a proposed development that's going to take place in their local area, that is generally seen as potentially having a hazardous effect on that local area. Sometimes the term NIMBY can be used against groups to suggest, oh, look, you're just interested in your own area, even if that group has a valid environmental argument. In other cases, it gets a bit more muddy. So there are certain pieces of environmental infrastructure that have to be put in place. In the old days, there were landfill sites. We're now looking at, say, incinerators, possibly. We're now looking at, say, bottle banks. And in some cases, there may be something that needs to be done for the environment and it has to be done in a certain area, but people in that area oppose it. So there can be the environmental impacts of these groups can vary depending on the issue. Now, on the other hand, all these groups will just simply, members of these groups will actually say, well, okay, you're saying we're NIMBYists, but look, we don't want this, and we know this is going to harm people in our area, so why should we not protest it? So it's kind of an interesting one. It's an interesting topic to think about. There's no right or wrong, I think, in relation to these so-called NIMBY groups. The last point Leonard makes he says, four forms of what he calls NIMBY resistance. He says, in some cases, a local organized group against a certain potential issue, a potential LULU, locally unwanted land use in their area, they can just stay local in scope. They might just focus on the issue. If they're successful and it stops, the group stops, and that's it, over and done with. In other cases, it's suggested some smaller NIMBY groups may actually start to ally with other similar groups and create a network of their own, and as such may become part of a wider campaign. So let's look at Irish environmental activism. And Liam Leonard talks about two different phases in Irish environmental activism, and two different types of phases where you can look at different issues and different ways of trying to get across environmental issues. So he's going to talk about first phase environmental groups, mainly relating in Ireland to the 1970s and 1980s. Groups that were mainly focused on issues to do with heritage and conservation or the adverse environmental effects of toxic multinational industries. And a lot of these groups tended to be very locally based, and there's very little, if any, linkages created between groups. The second phase, environmental groups, by contrast, emerged from the 1980s onwards, a very different economic climate in Ireland to that of the 1970s and 1980s, an economic climate where you're now experiencing economic growth. And a lot of the issues faced by groups in this period have to do with the knock-on effects of consumerism and growing waste levels. There's also issues to do with proposed new state infrastructure to kind of keep the wheels of the Celtic Tiger going, particularly new roads and so on. One of the big differences between the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s and 2000s is to do with ease of communication. So new developments in communication technologies effectively means that groups no longer had to exist in isolation, and they could now communicate much more easily with each other, but also communicate with experts in certain areas, other like-minded campaigners. Other groups now found it much easier to gather or gain information that would help them in their different groups, in their different campaigns, So let's look at the first phase of Irish environmental activism, the 1970s and the 1980s. To understand what was happening with the environmental action in this period, you need to understand the economics of the time. From the mid-1970s up until the early 1990s, Ireland went through a very prolonged period of recession. We had a recession in Ireland between 2008 and probably 2013, 2014. And that lasted a few years. That was not fun, but the recession in the 70s and 80s was a deep recession. It just felt, I grew up in that, it just felt as if this was it. Recession was going to be the only thing Ireland would be, this was it. Ireland would be always a poor country, it would always be economically underdeveloped, we'd have large numbers of unemployed people, very little economic growth, and when you're in the middle of the 1980s, it felt as that's the way things were going to stay. So this was a key factor in terms of understanding environmental activism, because the government, or the governments at the time, were desperate for overseas investment that would help to create employment. So there was a policy of trying to draw in overseas multinational investment. And a lot of this investment came in the chemicals and pharmaceutical sector. A lot of these were highly polluting plants that wouldn't be allowed in other more economically advanced countries. But Ireland sort of said, you know what, we're that desperate for jobs, we'll take these plants, please, come in. So a lot of the environmental activism that takes place in the 1970s and the 1980s generally is focused on these particular industries or these particular plants. So a lot of the environmental activities tend to be focused on protests against a specific plant or protests against the environmental effects associated with specific pharmaceutical or chemical plants, usually in rural parts of the country. The roots of Irish environmental activism dates back to the 1970s. Early environmental activism focuses around attempts to prevent the destruction of parts of George and Dublin, which had probably limited, if no success. Protests about the proposal to build the new city council offices on the Wood Quay site. That was probably one of the first significant environmental examples of environmental activism in Ireland. As the final point there suggests, it was sort of a success to certain degrees, but not to other degrees in terms of what that protest achieved. So it was the first ever protest occupation. The final conclusion was that it was decided, okay, we need to try and do something to protect this site, but we still want to build the city council offices here. So you know what, we'll build the city council office on stilts over the site. So we won't have foundations in the ground, but the city council offices are still over the site. The other big issue for the Irish environmental movement in the 1970s was a proposal to build a nuclear power plant at Carnsore Point in County Wexford. And this was a big issue in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Now, in the end, this nuclear power plant was never built. Whether it was because the groups were so successful in blocking it remains open to question. Ultimately, I think the main issue at that point in time was that the government just didn't have the funding to build this power plant in any case. So, groups at this period of time. Groups at this point in time remained generally locally based and generally very small. Usually there were environmental groups such as the groups protesting against certain pharmaceutical industries. Groups tend to be locally based, they were quite small, and really they had very little resources at hand, very little scope to get across their ideas. They might achieve some success in getting some media attention, but by and large, groups in this period faced a lot of struggles that groups in the 1990s and 2000s didn't. Groups probably had to remain locally based because there was very little means of communicating with people in other parts of Ireland at that point in time. At that point in time, if you wanted to communicate with people outside of your hometown, you had the telephone system, which was in the 1970s, a lot of Irish people didn't have a telephone. So you had to rely on A, getting access to maybe a pay telephone in the village, and B, hoping that the person you wanted to talk to actually had a telephone themselves. If they didn't, then really there was no point phoning them. You could also try to communicate people by mail, but the mail was very slow in Ireland, and we had a couple of mail strikes as well in the 70s and 80s just to make things harder. So by and large, groups really, because it was so hard, environmental groups really didn't bother trying to kind of link up with each other or communicate with each other because it just was too hard to do in any cases. If you needed to get information to help develop a campaign, the only way you could get information was going down to your local library and sitting down and reading as many books or papers as you could get your hands on. A lot of the big activities, as I said before, a lot of the environmental activities in the 70s and particularly the 80s was generally focused on opposition to the adverse environmental effects of mainly United States-led multinational toxic industry developments. Some of these were, for instance, the Merrill Dow plant, protests against the Merrill Dow plant in Cork, Merck Sharp and Dome in Tipperary, and there was a cross-border dimension to it as well. Now, moving into the 1990s, and things start to change for the Irish environmental movement. First of all, the factors start to change. The Irish economy all of a sudden starts to move from a very underdeveloped economy within a European perspective to one of the more developed European economies. So this takes place over a very short period of time in the 1990s and early 2000s. The opening up of the economy to economic globalization sees a period of intense economic growth that gets referred to as the Celtic Tiger. You get growth in industrialization. Now, one of the positive dimensions of the fact that probably the main period of industrial growth in Ireland was the 1990s and 2000s is the fact that a lot of this industrial development is pretty clean industrial development. So you're looking at industries such as Intel as opposed to the old classic coal mines and steel factories that would have dominated the industrial revolution in the 1800s. There's a growing level of urbanization, so rapid level of housing development in the 1990s and 2000s, and a rapid growth in consumerism. So all these have the knock-on effect of very quickly creating a waste management crisis, which requires the government to take action on pollution control. So there's a lot of things happening in relation to waste management in this period of time. On the one hand, all of a sudden, the amounts of waste that have to be dealt with or disposed of suddenly increase quite dramatically. On the other hand, Ireland's becoming more and more part of the European Union, and the European Union is at the same time looking at Ireland and saying, look, Ireland, what are you doing about waste? And Ireland says, oh yeah, don't worry, we haven't covered that, don't worry, we just dig a big hole in the ground and throw all the waste into it. And Europe says, no, Ireland, that's not what you're supposed to do. Remember, you signed up to the European waste management hierarchy or the European waste management pyramid. And Ireland goes, ah? And Europe says, look, Ireland, landfill is the last resort. This should be the last resort you revert to when it comes to waste management. We would prefer you to be trying to recycle more waste. And Ireland goes, recycle, okay, right, we'll try and do that. Trying to reuse, so recycle and reuse more. But if you have waste that you have to dispose of, then we think you should go down the route of incineration, which at least will create energy, as opposed to landfill. Because in the mindset of the European Union and the European Union waste management hierarchy, landfill was viewed as the least desirable way of dealing with waste. So Europe says, look, Ireland, this idea of having a big town dump for every county, look, you've got to move away from that. You've got to move in line with European practices in waste management. So this is a focus of a lot of conflict in terms of the environmental movement in the 1990s and 2000s, because government is looking to change its approach to waste management. In some cases, it's been forced to do so by Europe. I started to suggest, okay, we will try to recycle more, but we're probably going to have to dispose of waste. So now Europe wants us to move away from the landfill site approach. So we're now going to try and develop a number of incinerators. And incinerators wasn't really a thing that was done in Ireland, and this did kind of creep out a lot of people a lot. So you start to see a lot of cases where incinerators are proposed, and very quickly there's a movement, an environmental group is created to oppose that proposed incinerator development. Some of the incinerators in the end don't actually take place or happen, whereas others like Ringsend do in the end get developed. But the development of these incinerators is held up because of the extent of the protests against them. In the end, the Irish government has to bring in new policies that more or less says, look, Europe is now screaming at us to get this waste management infrastructure in place, and they're threatening us with fines. On the other hand, all these environmental groups are trying to block us from doing so. So I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to bring in new laws that will allow us to more or less short circuit or speed up the planning process for developments, critical developments such as these. So there was a shift in focus away from the issues that concerned environmental groups in the 1970s and 1980s to new concerns in the 1990s and 2000s. The proposed waste management infrastructure, but also in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a big process of road building in Ireland to more or less try and keep the Celtic Tiger on the road, but also, let's be honest, to try and reduce the travelling times it takes to go from Dublin to other parts of the country. So these are the new big issues of environmental groups in the 1990s and the first two decades of the 2000s. Because the Irish economy is doing so well, at this point in time, Ireland no longer needs to be drawing in new pharmaceutical industries. And by this stage, to some extent, the pharmaceutical industries are starting to get their act together in any case and clean up their act. So a lot of campaigns that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s are generally eco-populist campaigns, but they're generally opposing infrastructure developments or infrastructure developments that are usually supported by the state. So there's issues to do with resources, about our conservation. So the proposal to build a motorway beside the hill of Tara, the Shell to Sea protests against Shell to Sea. There's protests against new landfill site developments in places like Ennis and Kilcock and Tralee and Galway. Protests against proposed developments of incinerators at Poolbeg or Ringsend in Dublin, Ringaskiddy in Cork, Duleek in County Meath, and also there's protests in other places such as Galway and Rathcoole. So what have been the impacts of activism, environmental activism in Ireland? There have been some positive developments. First of all, some potentially harmful projects have been delayed or in some cases abandoned. So it could be argued that the Irish environmental group did prevent the development of a nuclear power plant in Carnsore Point in the 1970s and 1980s, for instance. Activism has also led to a growing awareness amongst the general public of environmental issues, but also health and heritage issues associated with the environment. On the other hand, when groups have become quite successful in blocking proposed developments, it's tapped into a growing sense of anti-environmentalism in Ireland, which comes to the fore now again and again, particularly when certain policies are brought in that aren't very popular. So the general sense that all environmental policies or all environmental actions are popular doesn't really match up with reality. So I suppose the classic example of this is the carbon tax, which in itself, when I'll talk about economic mechanisms or environmental policy mechanisms next week, as an idea in itself, it sounds good. Okay, if you bring in the carbon tax, it might discourage people from, it's an economic measure to try to discourage people from overusing their car, etc. But the knock-on effect of this is it does increase petrol prices, and it's generally not a popular thing, particularly in working class areas or say in rural areas where people need to use their cars more. So environmental activism, in turn, like the carbon tax in a way, it's tapped into a growing anti-environmentalism in Ireland. And in some cases, the actions of environmental groups haven't totally endeared themselves to the general public. Now, the general public might be happy enough if an environmental group is blocking a proposed incinerator in their area. The public isn't as happy, by contrast, if an environmental group is blocking the proposed development of a new motorway. So you're too young to remember before the motorways were developed, but back in the old days, if you wanted to go from Dublin, say even from somewhere fairly close like Portlaoise, you'd have to drive through a number of towns. You go through Ballybritches, village, not too bad. Monasterevin would take you ages to get through. And then you have another few miles and you come to Kildare. That'd take a while to get through. Then Newbridge, that'd take a while to get through. And then Naas would take ages to get through. And by the time you got out of Naas, then you still had another 20 miles to go to get to Dublin. Even before my own lifetime, you had to travel through places like Rathcoole as well before you got to Dublin. Rathcoole, I think they had to also go through Sagart as well. So before the motorways were developed, it took ages to get from place to place. So when with the proposed development of motorways, they were, to be honest, quite popular with the public. What wasn't as popular with the public was when environmental groups tried to slow up these motorways or tried to block these motorways to totally block these motorways. So there were protests in the Glen of Imal against the development of the M11. In the views of environmentalists, these were kind of, look, this motorway is going to damage the environment, or it's damaging this particular piece of woodland here. In the views of the public, it was like, what are you doing? It's taken us ages to get from one place to another. And this was Celtic Tiger. A lot of people are now travelling to Dublin to work. We need to get to Dublin to work. We don't want to spend 5 hours a day travelling a journey that might only take us 2 hours if we had a bloody motorway there. Stop blocking the bloody motorways. So in some ways, environmental groups were almost victims of their own success. Because they were so successful, they'd learned to become more successful in terms of direct action means of blocking infrastructure developments, but also legalistic means of blocking infrastructure developments. They were also able to kind of use the planning system to slow up developments such as the motorways and incinerators as well. So because of the success of environmental groups, because we're so successful, you're seeing motorways that have been planned for, say, 2000, the end of that motorway, or the end of the development of that motorway, was being pushed forward a number of years later. And this did lead to growing resentment, not just amongst the political class, but amongst the general public about the actions of environmental groups. Environmental groups and environmental actions were also generally in conflict with the dominant ideology within the Celtic Tiger. The dominant ideology of the Celtic Tiger was, look, you can see yourselves, economic development is a good thing. Look, you have more money in your pockets. You can now afford to do this and that and the other, which you weren't able to do in the 1980s. This is a good thing. And a lot of what environmental groups were arguing for was in conflict with this general Celtic Tiger ideology. So what are the impacts of activism in Ireland? There was a lot of conflicts about environmental issues and a lot of resentment about developments being held up. Bertie Ahern, who was the Prime Minister during the Celtic Tiger, Prime Minister Taoiseach during the Celtic Tiger, had a few broadsides against environmental groups. At one stage, he started protesting. He started complaining that the M7 motorway and the M11 motorway was being held up by environmental activists. He said, look, project delays are being linked to swan snails and the occasional person hanging out of a tree. The occasional person hanging out of a tree, that was the M11 when environmental activists chained themselves to trees to prevent the trees being removed to allow for the development of the motorway. The snail, that was the snails from Pollardstown Fen, which basically was an environmental issue that held up the M7 motorway development for a number of years, and that also caused a certain level of disquiet amongst the general public, but also amongst the political class as well. So the decision by politicians was, look, we need to get around these protests. We need to get around the fact that environmental groups can actually hold up these projects, not just by direct action means, but also by kind of more or less dragging these developments through the planning system, more or less slowing these developments, doing everything they can to use the planning system, to use legal measures to slow these developments. So ultimately, in the mid-2000s, the government developed what was called the Critical Infrastructure Bill, which basically allowed the government to fast-track the planning process for infrastructure that could be deemed as critical to the well-being of the state. And as such, if the government goes down this route, it will have the effect of constraining future collective action on environmental issues. There was also a general sense that the environmental lobby wasn't very smart as well. Environmental groups weren't very smart. They didn't take account or make use of opportunities that were open to them during the Celtic Tiger era. So the Green Party ended up in government between 2007 and 2011. And this could have been a good opportunity for environmental groups to have had a lot more say on government policy than they did prior to the Greens going into government. But generally, environmental groups didn't really get on the board. A lot of environmental groups seem to be spending their time going, why are you in government? The Greens were going, we're in government to try and get things done on the environment. Why are you in government? The Greens were going, could you guys actually support us here? We're a small party in government. We need all the support we can get. And the environmental groups really, in the late 2000s, they really just didn't row in behind to kind of support the actions of the Greens. Greens were saying, look, we're not going to get everything done. We can get something done. The groups are going, why aren't you getting everything done? And the Greens were going, because we're often a party with just 6 TDs in a government with a party with 77 TDs. That's why. Maybe if you lot actually kind of give us a bit of moral support and helped us, we might get more done. And the environmental groups came back in, why are you in government? And the Greens just said, why? Now, funnily enough, when you move forward to the period between 2020 and 2024, you see a more proactive, more effective linkage between environmental groups and the Green Party. And the Green Party, when they go back to government for a second time between 2020 and 2024, they end up achieving a lot more in relation to environment as a result. So final quote on this section from Liam Leonard, he says, the formation of Irish environmental policy could be viewed as emerging in a dualistic response to bottom-up grassroots agitation on the one hand, and top-down EU legislation on the other hand. So this is an interesting point he's making there. The idea that the Irish government, in trying to develop environmental policy, was caught in the middle between local environmental groups trying to say, we don't want this to take place, and on the other hand, the European Union, on the other hand, saying, look, Ireland, come on, get with the story. Modernise your waste management infrastructure, otherwise we are going to pile a pile of fines on you. And what the hell? Come on, Ireland. Your road system is a mess. Here, we're giving you money to build your roads. Build those bloody roads now. So the Irish government sometimes found itself caught in the middle between those, that kind of the European Union on the one hand and local environmental groups on the other hand, all looking for different things. As the quote says, in Ireland, its populist political makeup lends itself to the attainment of, for some leverage for movements, particularly at a local level. So the fact that Irish democracy, the way the Irish democracy operates, generally there is windows of opportunity for local environmental groups to achieve some level of success, especially if they can get buy-in from the public, because the government needs votes to stay empowered. So if the government gets a sense that there is a popular support for certain local environmental activities or certain local environmental initiatives, by and large the government probably won't want to go against that unless it's really seemed to be damaging to the economy. However, Leonard suggests the economic imperative of the state still dominates at the policy level. Even though there are occasional openings up of political opportunities for environmental groups and other groups to have an impact, mainly taking place around the time of elections. So this idea that an election can be a political opportunity space for groups to try and get things done that may not be there a year later when there's no election and not an election likely to be due for another few years. Okay, everyone, so that's kind of an hour and a half. That's 2 lectures in one. So hopefully you'll have listened to this and you'll get something out of this.